They were born in a golden age, in silken cradles, to the whispers of eunuchs and the scent of rosewater. Their father was the lord of half the world, Suleiman the Magnificent, the one who made Europe tremble. Their mother was Hürrem, the woman who rewrote the rules in the heart of the Ottoman Empire, rising from slave to the one and only Sultana. It seemed the ticket to life was won even before their first cry. But the Topkapi Palace is no fairy tale castle. It is a labyrinth where gold on the walls neighbors the chill of intrigue, and the rustle of silk gowns drowns out the quiet rasp of daggers being drawn. History did not preserve their childish laughter. It meticulously recorded the dates of births, marriages, and deaths. Of Hurrem and Suleiman's 6 children, only 1 daughter and 1 son outlived their father. The others were destined for the fate common to princes of the blood, an early departure shrouded in a fog of illness, tragedy, and political expediency. Today, thanks to the series The Magnificent Century, these historical shadows have gained flesh, blood, and millions of admirers. We empathize with the mischievous Shahzadeh Mehmed, the passionate Mihrimah, the headstrong Mustafa, Hürrem's stepson, yet a pivotal figure in the drama, the handsome Selim, little Bayezid, and fragile Jihangir. The series has built a powerful emotional bridge to the 16th century. But where does poetic fiction end and the dry, often cruel chronicle begin? The truth is, their destinies are the perfect plot for a Shakespearean tragedy, written not with a pen, but with yataghans, plague, and dynastic cold calculation. This is a story not only of a mother's love and ambition, but also of the iron logic of the imperial machine, for which even the sultan's children are pieces on a chessboard. Their lives and deaths are not random. Each one is a move in the great game for the ultimate prize, the throne, which, as is known, has no brothers. Let's set aside the vivid images from the TV series and take a closer look at the archival scrolls, at the dates written beside the names, at the age at which death found them. There is no room for sentiment here, only facts, figures, and the relentless march of history, which turned the descendants of the magnificent sultan into victims of time, disease, and the very system that raised their parents to the pinnacle of the world. Their stories are the flip side of greatness, the price paid for living in a gilded cage called the Ottoman dynasty. This won't be a dry lecture, only gripping stories based on documents. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss new videos on the channel. This was not just a family. This was a living chessboard where the pieces were the destinies of 6 children and the prize was the greatest throne in the world. Hürrem, who rose from slavery to become the lawful wife of the sovereign of the faithful, understood the rules of the game better than anyone. Her motherhood was not a sentimental idol, but a continuation of politics, a strategy for survival in the most brutal dynastic regime on the planet. There were 6 of them, born in the palace and doomed to eternal competition with one another by the cruel law of the Ottomans. The strongest survives, while the others depart. Hürrem tried to rewrite this law, to bend it to the will of a mother who wanted to keep all her children alive. But history delivered its own merciless verdict. Spring 1521, in the heart of Topkapi, where stone walls hold the whispers of intrigue, the cry of a newborn rings out. This was not merely another child in the vast harem. This was a son born to the Sultan and his rapidly rising favorite Hürrem, at a time when the dynasty itself, ravaged by a smallpox epidemic, was gasping for lack of heirs. He was named Mehmed, 2 sacred names in one, for his conquering grandfather, Sultan Selim the Grim, and for the Prophet. This was not a choice, it was a manifesto. The celebrations for his circumcision lasted for weeks, and court-hired poets were already lavishly using the epithet, the pearl. But behind this brilliance lay a cold strategy. For Hürrem, who had not yet solidified her position as the Sultan's only woman, this boy was a ticket to eternity, and she invested everything in him. Mehmed did not grow up as just a prince. He was the perfect Ottoman heir. He was sent to the Sanjak of Manisa, the traditional school for crown princes. But he was not a mere slashing warrior. Contemporaries remembered him differently, a youth of refined taste, commissioning exquisite miniatures, writing poetry under the pseudonym Mehmed, and engaging in philosophical conversations with learned men. He patronized architects and calligraphers. Yes, he suppressed Janissary revolts in his province, but he did so more as an efficient administrator than as a ruthless commander. Suleiman, weary of endless rebellions and the ambitions of his own relatives, saw in Mehmed a dream, an intelligent, loyal, cultured ruler who could not only conquer but also govern. Hürrem, meanwhile, was playing her own game, building a network of loyal pashas and viziers around her son, trying to shield him from the main threat, his charismatic half-brother, Mustafa. And here history takes its somersault. Autumn 1543, Manisa. Mehmed is 22. He is in the prime of life, at the peak of his potential. After one of the feasts, he is struck by a sudden illness. The official chronicles dryly record the symptoms: hellish fever, crimson rash, convulsions. The clinical picture is horrifyingly familiar: smallpox, the very same disease that had decimated the harem's nurseries in his childhood, had returned to collect its debt. Death was swift. The news reaches Suleiman on a military campaign far to the east, and here Suleiman's style of rule cracks, revealing simply a father. He abandons everything, his army, his strategy, his conquests, and races to Istanbul to personally escort the coffin bearing his son's body. This scene is worth a dozen treatises on power, the most powerful man on the planet, broken by grief. His sorrow would be carved in stone, the legendary Shehzade Mosque, with its elegant minarets and imposing mausoleum. This is not merely a tomb, it is a scream in architecture. But in the Ottoman palace there is no vacuum. Even as the funeral prayers were being recited, whispers were already filling the corridors and embassies. The Venetian ambassador hints cautiously in his dispatch, not without the help of poison. Suspicion falls upon Mustafa's camp. Later, historians would throw up their hands. There is no proof. In all likelihood, the prosaic truth is more banal and dreadful than any intrigue. Unsanitary conditions, a lack of immunity, and medieval medicine. But the consequences of this death were entirely political. Having lost her strongest piece, Hürrem doubles her stakes in the game for the throne for her younger sons, Selim and Bayezid. Suleiman, disillusioned with the very idea of a peaceful succession, grows ever more suspicious and cruel. And Mustafa, without desiring it, finds himself in the focus of his father's deadly attention. Mehmed's demise is not merely a family tragedy. It is the trigger for a chain of events that 10 years later would lead to a carpet in a tent near Erigli, where Mustafa would be strangled on the orders of his own father. Mehmed's potential remained an unwritten draft of history. He died without having seized the throne or raised a rebellion. He remains in memory as a ghost of an alternative path for the Ottoman Empire, the path of an intellectual, a patron of the arts, perhaps a reformer. But history, as we know, does not tolerate the question, what if? It merely notes that his early departure made the coming struggle for the throne all the more bloody and merciless. Mihrimah Sultan, the beloved daughter of Suleiman, she came into the world bearing the name Sun and Moon, Mihrimah. This was not merely a poetic metaphor, but a direct indication of her future role. In an empire where daughters were often pawns in diplomatic games, she became a trump card, the only girl born of the union between Suleiman the lawgiver and Hürrem. The fate of her brothers was written in blood. The road to the throne was littered with corpses. Her path was different, a shadow cast by two celestial bodies at once, which in time itself became a source of light. From childhood, she was given not just dolls, but entire states to play with. While her peers memorized rules of etiquette, Mihrimah mastered the dialects of power. Persian for poetry and negotiations with the East, Italian to read the reports of Venetian merchants, Arabic, the language of the Quran and high science. Her textbook was Hurrem herself. The mother did not simply love her daughter, she was preparing in her a successor, an ally, a second mind and a second pair of hands. And Suleiman, that unapproachable padishah, melted before the pearl of his heart. He took her with him, allowed her to listen to the counsel of the divan, something that never happened before or after. She was his living bridge between the harsh world of male politics and the complex world of harem intrigues where destinies were decided.
At 17, Mihrimah did not simply marry, she entered into a strategic alliance. Rustem Pasha was not merely a grand vizier, he was a man of the system created by Hürrem. He is called a miser and a schemer, and that is true, but for Mihrimah he became the perfect instrument, loyal, intelligent, and absolutely devoted to the family clan. This marriage was not a love story, it was a merger of Rustem's administrative power with Mihrimah's blood closeness to the Sultan. After Hurrem's death in 1558, the harem did not plunge into mourning, it simply changed its leader. Mihrimah inherited the position of the empire's first woman. Now she was not just a daughter, but the right hand of the aging Suleiman. Her pen scratched across paper more often than a yataghan, letters to Europeans, instructions to governors, secret notes to her father in military camps. It was she, as a subtle psychologist, who smoothed over sharp edges when Suleiman's wrath fell upon one of her brothers, and it was she who made her choice in the War of Succession. Her bet was on her brother Selim, the future Selim II the Sot. Not because he was stronger or smarter than Bayezid, but because he was more pliable. Her influence became one of the key factors in a series of terrible decisions, the execution of her half-brother Mustafa, and then of her full brother Bayezid. This was politics elevated to the level of a family drama. When Selim II ascended the throne, Mihrimah's finest hour had only just begun. Her brother, more occupied with his whims than affairs of state, entrusted her with the reins of government. Grand viziers came and went at her word. Diplomatic missions were approved within her chambers. She did not sign firmans, but they were born from her council. At her initiative, peace was made with Persia and Cyprus was captured. Her generosity was materialized in stone, 2 grand architectural complexes in Istanbul, the creations of Sinan. The Mihrimah Mosque in Üsküdar, as light as her name, and the mosque at Edirne, where 16 windows flood the interior with light, a metaphor for the enlightenment of the patroness herself. These were not merely charitable projects, this was politics in stone, an assertion of power and piety. Yet behind this triumph stood a series of personal catastrophes. She had outlived almost everyone, her husband Rustem, her father Suleiman the Magnificent, her rival brothers, even her own sons who died before her. Her world built with such effort crumbled, leaving her alone in the center of an emptying hall of power. But she did not break. During the reign of her grandson Murad III, she remained a formidable force, intriguing against his favorite Safiye Sultan, striving to maintain control. She was over 50, but retirement meant nothing in a world where influence was the only currency. She died on January 25th, 1578, at the age of 56. Not from poison, nor an assassin's dagger, nor from plague. From age, the rarest illness in her dynasty. She was buried in her father's turbe at the Suleimania Mosque. Her story is not one of love or motherhood. It is a masterclass in survival in a world where the throne devoured its children. Her brothers fell victim to the system. She, however, learned to wield this system, becoming the invisible framework that held the empire together while sultans drank wine or became lost in the harem. She did not rule officially. She was the operating system of the Ottoman Empire for 3 generations. Shehzade Abdullah, the forgotten infant. Between the triumphal battles of Suleiman and the intrigues of the harem, there was a quiet room where an infant's cry fell silent. Shehzade Abdullah. His name in the chronicles is a line on a list, a point between the births of Mihrimah and Selim. He did not even live to the age when children are given their first toy sword. He was born around 1523, not the simplest of times. Hürrem, then not yet the all-powerful Haseki, but an ambitious favorite, had just given birth to a daughter. The appearance of a son was a trump card in her long game against Mahidevran. It would seem here was a living argument, the Sultan's second son born to Hürrem. But the empire at that moment was like a huge, beautiful but infected organism. While Suleiman planned new conquests, the Black Death was stalking Istanbul with its narrow streets and open canals. The plague did not discriminate between who you were, a poor peddler or a prince of the blood. Dysentery, smallpox, typhus, the usual set of childhood risks in the 16th century. The chance of not living to see 5 was 50-50, even in the gilded cage of Topkapi. Abdullah became a statistic. He died in 1526 at 2 or 3 years old, presumably from the plague. In that very year, his father, on the other end of Europe, on the field at Mohatz, forever crushed the kingdom of Hungary. While Suleiman was entering history as a great conqueror, his son was quietly passing from life in the chambers of the old palace. The Sultan did not have time to say goodbye. There was no lavish funeral for adult princes. The infant's body was temporarily laid to rest somewhere on the palace grounds, and later in a modest, now forgotten tomb.
Ottoman historians noted it briefly, God's will. European ambassadors in their reports even confused whose son he was, Hurrem's or Mahidevran's. He was so small that he did not have time to become a political figure, and thus did not merit the attention of chroniclers. No portraits, no mentions of character or illnesses, simply born, existed, and vanished. There are dozens of such forgotten princes in Ottoman history. Their fate is the silent counterpoint to the romance of television series. But for Hurrem, this was not a statistic. It was a personal catastrophe, seared into memory. She was around 23 years old. She had journeyed from slavery into the heart of the Sultan, and each of her children was not merely a child, but a brick in the edifice of her safety and power. To lose a son meant to shake the entire structure. The chronicles say she sank into deep mourning, weeks of seclusion, refusal of food. This bitterness turned into cold steel. If the world was so fragile and diseases could snatch sons from the cradle, then the survivors needed to be protected not only from microbes, but from people, from any hint of a threat. Her famous cruelty and paranoia regarding her children's future, perhaps it stems from here, from that quiet room where a tiny heart ceased to beat. Abdullah's death is not just a family drama, it is a systemic failure. It showed Suleiman that even the palace walls offered no refuge from epidemics. There is a version that later this very loss would push him to introduce strict quarantine measures in the army, and Hürrem, having become an influential figure, would invest in infrastructure, the construction of hammams, fountains and aqueducts, not only as an act of charity, but as an attempt to defeat unsanitary conditions, that invisible killer of heirs. Were there whispers of poison? In a harem where Mahidevran and her clan saw Hürrem's sons as a direct threat to Mustafa, such talk inevitably hung in the air, but historians find no confirmation for them. Most likely, the truth is more banal and terrifying: nature and the conditions of the time. The epidemiological situation in the capital was as much a political factor then as a Janissary revolt. In popular culture, Abdullah does not exist. The creators of the series The Magnificent Century unhesitatingly erased him from the script so as not to splinter the audience's attention between numerous children. The drama demanded clarity: the villain Ibrahim, the rival Mustafa, the favorite Mehmed. The tragedy of an infant dying from an unclear illness did not fit into the epic plot about power. But it is precisely in this insignificance that the main truth lies. The brilliance of Suleiman's century cast deep shadows, and within these shadows tiny fates were lost. Abdullah did not become a sultan, nor a rebel, nor a poet. He only had time to become a loss, and a quiet, invisible engine that forced his mother to clench her will into a fist and fight for the survival of her remaining children, now without rules and sentiment.
Shehzade Selim, the drunkard on the throne. He came into the world on May 28, 1524, to the roar of cannons, announcing his father Suleiman the Magnificent's new victories. Shehzade Selim, Hürrem's fourth child, was born not in a province, but in the very heart of the empire, in Istanbul. His birth was more than just a family event. Every son of Hürrem was living proof of her unshakable status, a nail in the coffin of the old harem order. But if her first sons, Mehmed and Mustafa, carried a glimmer of their father's greatness, Selim from the very beginning was different. He grew up in the shadow of perfect princes, while Mustafa perfected swings of the yataghan and learned to lead armies, and Mehmed immersed himself in philosophy and poetry. Young Selim showed a penchant for simpler pleasures. His classical education in the Sanjaks of Manisa and Konya, Quran, tactics, governance, fell on rocky soil. His real universities were the banquet halls and hunting grounds. Contemporaries whispered, "The prince's grip is weak. He lacks that very sultan's blood that could burn with passion and freeze with resolve simultaneously." Hürrem, a genius of intrigue, saw this with agonizing clarity. But there was no retreat. After the death of her beloved Mehmed and the estrangement of Mustafa, Mahidevran's son, Selim became her last card in the game for the Ottoman throne, and she played this card with the desperation of a strategist fighting a siege. Alliances with viziers, subtle compliments in letters to the sultan, neutralizing ill wishes, everything was thrown into compensating for her son's innate weaknesses. And Selim, meanwhile, lived and drank. By the age of 20, the reputation of the merry prince had become proverbial. The Venetian envoy described him without mincing words: a drunkard, a carouser, spending his nights in the company of low-ranking janissaries and dubious concubines. Picture this: a Shehzade, descendant of formidable padishahs, lounging casually, sipping wine to the dreary sound of music. His father, Suleiman, watched this with growing contempt. After Mustafa's execution in 1553, the path to the throne for Selim seemed to have been cleared, but Suleiman hesitated.
His gaze turned increasingly towards Bayezid, the younger yet more energetic and warlike son of Hürrem. And here begins the great Ottoman drama, the death of Cihangir, followed by the open rebellion of Bayezid, the lost battle at Konya in 1559, and the flight to Persia. Selim, supported by his mother and the all-powerful Grand Vizier Rustem Pasha, found himself on top, literally. He pursued his brother, fulfilling his father's will, and in 1561, in distant Qazvin, by order of Suleiman, Bayezid and his 5 sons were strangled. Silence. Selim remained the only living male heir, the default victor.
On September 7, 1566, Suleiman the Magnificent died, near Shigitvar in his campaign tent. Upon learning the news, Selim did not rush to his father's body. His coronation was swift and lavish. Thus, Selim II ascended to the throne, guarded by the ghosts of his brothers. And here the most interesting part began. The reign of Selim II is a perfect case where the personal vices of one man may not destroy, but, in a strange way, govern an empire with its own inertia. He earned the nicknames Selim the Drunkard, Sarhosh, and Selim the Blonde, Sutter. Without delving into routine, he entrusted the reins to the empire's wise mechanic, Grand Vizier Sokolu Mehmed Pasha. The Sultan himself retired to his chambers in Topkapi, where his faithful companions became jugs of wine from Kefe and the company of his favorite, Nurbanu, who skillfully ruled the harem. The empire, wound up by Suleiman like a giant flywheel, continued to move by inertia. Under Selim II, the Ottoman state reached its maximum geographical extent. It was during his reign that Cyprus was conquered in 1570–71. Yes, that very Venetian operation that led to the defeat of the fleet at Lepanto. The defeat was crushing, but Cyprus, a strategic island, a source of the sweet wines the Sultan so loved, remained in Ottoman hands. The irony of fate, the main military success of the drunkard Sultan's reign fueled his chief vice. He was rotting from the inside. Chronic alcoholism, as described by an Ottoman historian, was not about revelry, but a grim routine, daily drinking until dawn, trembling hands, a clouded mind. Yet he was not untalented. He patronized the arts. Under his rule, the genius Sinan completed the Suleymaniye complex and began building Istanbul's second most significant mosque, Selimiye, a masterpiece of Ottoman architecture. The end came on December 13, 1574. The official version was a stroke in the hammam, but the details betray cirrhosis of the liver, a fall on the slippery floor, loss of speech, paralysis, agony. He was 50 years old. His death was as ignoble as his father's had been majestic. Selim II was buried next to Suleiman in the shadow of the Suleymaniye Mosque. The last son of Hurrem found his rest in the shadow of the Colossus.
His reign lasted 8 years and became an imperceptible yet fateful turning point. He is the living bridge between the era of conquerors and the era of recluses. Under him, the triumvirate of power was firmly established: a weak sultan, a strong grand vizier, and an all-powerful valide sultan. The sultanate of women did not begin with him, but his weakness cleared the path for women to wield unchallenged influence. In the series Magnificent Century, his image was embellished, given charm and inner drama. Reality was more prosaic and worse. Shehzade Selim won the great dynastic race not because he was faster or smarter. He simply remained the last one on the track because all his competitors had crashed against the rock of Suleiman's will. His throne was stained with the blood of his father, brothers, and nephews, and he ruled sitting on that throne with a golden cup in his trembling hand, while the flywheel of the empire, which had gained incredible speed under his father, finally began to emit its first quiet, almost inaudible creak, the creak of decline. Shehzade Bayezid, the ultimate rebel. His story could have been the perfect script for a blockbuster film. A warrior hero, the beloved favorite of the Janissaries, a queen mother who saw in him the future sultan. But the finale turned out bloody and merciless. Shehzade Bayezid was born in 1525 or 1526, at the very time when the Ottoman saber at Mohacs forever changed the map of Europe. The energy of that triumph seemed to have flowed into this infant. He was the complete opposite of his brothers. He didn't bury himself in books like the prematurely deceased Mehmed, nor did he seek solace at the bottom of a wine cup like Selim. His element was the sweat of horses, the ring of steel, and the fierce cry of attack. Hürrem bet her bets on him after Mustafa's death. She wasn't just raising a son, she was cultivating an alternative to weakness, indecisiveness, to everything she was beginning to notice with growing anxiety in Selim. Bayezid grew up in the hothouse of her mother's ambitions, but after Hürrem's death in 1558, that hothouse collapsed. What remained was a cold, wind-swept world where only one man stood by the throne, the aging Suleiman, and beside him 2 sons who hated each other with a fierce, animalistic hatred. Their squabbles at official receptions became a courtly attraction. Bayezid accused Selim of drunkenness and cowardice. Selim retorted, hinting at his brother's rebellious sentiments. Tension built up like steam in a boiler, ready to blow its lid at any moment.
The lid blew off in Konya in 1559. Bayezid, unwilling to await his father's mercy or his brother's strike, raised the banner of open rebellion. 20,000 Janissaries, the elite of the army, followed their favorite against the legitimate governor, Selim. This was not merely a quarrel over succession, it was a challenge to the entire system, where the Sultan's word was law. Upon receiving the news, Suleiman felt not anger, but the deepest shock. He tried to stop the fratricidal slaughter by recalling Bayezid to Kütahya, but the point of no return had been crossed. Then Bayezid made a move that had no justification under the Ottoman Code of Honor. He fled, not to the mountains, nor to a fortress, but to the empire's bitterest enemy, to the Persian Shah Tahmasp I. Treason? Yes, but also the desperate gamble of a man cornered by the politics of family. In Persia, he was met not with an ally's throne room, but with a gilded cage. Shah Tahmasp, the cynical and calculating man, staged an auction. On one side, a fugitive prince he could use as a trump card. On the other, a furious Suleiman, sending letters and gold. For 2 years, Bayezid lived in suspense in Qazvin, an honored prisoner, his life the subject of a bidding war. His fate was decided not on the battlefield, but in the silence of offices, among sealed parchments and the hints of diplomats. The verdict, delivered by his father in the summer of 1561, was a dry note, but behind it stood the full weight of the imperial machine. The law of Mehmed the Conqueror, that very decree stating a brother must kill a brother for the sake of order in the state, was set in motion. On September 25, 1561, executioners, observing Ottoman etiquette for those of royal blood, tightened a silk cord around his neck.
Bayezid's 5 sons were executed on the spot, and his daughter was drowned in the Tigris, so that not even a shadow of a dynastic alternative would remain. His story is the collapse of the concept that the strong are always right. In the Ottoman game for the throne, the victor was not the bravest warrior, but the most survivable prince. Selim, whom everyone considered a weakling, outlived his mighty brother simply because he made no sudden moves. Bayezid, with his charisma and fury, became a tragic and in some ways even modern figure, a rebel against the system, crushed by its faceless millstones. He did not lose because he was weak, he lost because he was playing by the wrong rules, and changing them was beyond his power.
Prince Jahangir. In this story, Prince Mustafa, the eldest and most capable son of Suleiman, was the sun, the source of light and warmth around which the hopes of the empire revolved, and Jahangir, the youngest, the 6th child of Hurrem and Suleiman, was the moonlight, gentle, reflected, living in the shadow and destined to fade when his sun was extinguished. He was born in 1531, when Suleiman's empire already sprawled across 3 continents, and his mother, Hurrem, had become the unshakable Valid in the heart of the Sultan. His birth was meant to be the final chord in the symphony of the dynasty's might, but nature had its own adjustments. The boy was born with a hunchback, a crooked spine, and a limp. In a world where a prince was to embody physical perfection and martial prowess, to be a mirror of his father, Suleiman the warrior, Jahangir was different from his first moments. Foreign ambassadors in their dispatches alluded to his infirmity. Ottoman chroniclers, holding their breath, wrote of a tender flower broken by the storm. He became the son of Suleiman, who never left the capital to govern a sanjak, that harsh school for future rulers. A sanjak for a prince was like an actor's first independent role. Jahangir was not given such a role. His stage was the chambers of Topkapi, and his audience were the doctors trying to ease his pains with herbs and baths, and the eunuchs conveying the whispers of the harem. His father, Suleiman, adored him with a particular aching tenderness, calling him the jewel of my heart. He freed his son from the weight of armor, allowing him to immerse himself in poetry, music, and the intricacies of Persian calligraphy instead of swordsmanship. Hurrem, a strategist to her core, saw in him alone not an instrument of power, but simply a son, fragile, in need of protection. Yet within this gilded cage there grew not merely a recluse. Jahangir possessed a mind as sharp as an owl and the sensitive soul of a poet. He wrote poetry under the pen name Jahangir, conqueror of the world, a bitter irony for one whose world was confined to palace walls. And he had one pure and fatal attachment, to his half-brother, Prince Mustafa. Mustafa, the son of Mahidevran, was to Jahangir everything he himself could not be: strong, stately, beloved by the people and the janissaries, the embodiment of the Ottoman ideal. Their friendship, which began with shared lessons, was for Jahangir a window into another world, a world of possibilities, strength, and honest masculine valor. In Mustafa, he saw not his mother's rival, but an elder brother, a hero, a protector. In the autumn of 1553, during the Persian campaign, swayed by the slander of Hurrem's faction, Rustem Pasha, and his sister Mihrimah, Suleiman ordered Mustafa to be strangled in his own tent. The news, like a tsunami, engulfed Istanbul. When it reached Jahangir's chambers, it did what years of back pain could not. His inner world, held together by this one sole support, collapsed.
What did the 22-year-old prince feel? Not just grief, an existential collapse. His entire fragile existence, built around the admiration of an ideal, turned to dust.
Contemporaries described the Shehzade's state. He fell into a deep melancholy, refused food, and wept for days on end. The physical pains that had always tormented him sharpened to an unbearable degree. Chroniclers write of a fire in the heart and a surge of sorrow to the chest. His heart, likely already weakened by congenital ailments, could not withstand the double blow: chronic illness and acute murderous grief. 2 months after Mustafa's execution, on November 27, 1553, Shehzade Jihangir died. The official version, a surge to the heart, something like a massive heart attack from nervous shock. The unofficial whisper, echoing through the centuries, is far simpler and more terrible. He died of a broken heart, in both the literal and figurative sense. The death of Jihangir became the culmination of Suleiman's family tragedy. After it, only 2 remained in the arena: Shehzade Selim and Shehzade Bayezid, whose fratricidal war was now a foregone conclusion. Hürrem, the chief engineer of the intrigues against Mustafa, could not fail to understand her indirect guilt. Her calculated move led to the death of the one among her sons who did not desire the throne and was, for her, simply a child. European diplomats, of course, whispered about possible poison, hinting that Selim's faction had tidied up loose ends, but there is no evidence. The reality is more prosaic and more tragic. The 16th century, even for princes, knew no antibiotics, neurosurgery, or therapy for severe depression. A combination of congenital pathology, chronic stress, and acute psychological trauma was more than a sufficient prescription for an early departure. Jihangir left no mark on politics. He left a mark in poetry, in the legend of the humpback with a gold heart, and in a painful lesson for the dynasty. His fate vividly demonstrated that in the machinery of Ottoman power, not only those who scramble for its helm are broken, but also those who merely stand beside it, admiring its might. His quiet death in the chambers of Topkapi resonated for the family louder than any battle cry. It was a knock on the door behind which nothing remained but emptiness and grief.
The creators of the series took the Ottoman family chronicle, which could be described with dry lines like died of illness or executed by order, and pumped liters of melodramatic adrenaline into it. The reality of the 16th century rarely arranged beautiful deaths with final monologues. It operated differently, through microbes, cold calculation, and accidents. Take Shehzade Mehmed, Suleiman's favorite son by Hürrem. In the series, his departure is an entire detective season with poisoning orchestrated by Mahidevran, agony, and universal grief. It's pure theatrical poison, created for maximum dramatic intensity. The historical Mehmed died in 1543 in Manisa of smallpox, or more likely from a rapid infection, perhaps pneumonia or sepsis, contracted during one of the feasts. The pre-antibiotic era was merciless. A healthy young man could burn out in a matter of days. Most likely, it was a banal medical tragedy, one of thousands, except the victim was the heir to the throne. The series, however, turned this tragedy into an arena for the confrontation between Hürrem and Mahidevran, amplifying the latter's image as the eternal poisoner, even though her real role by that time was already extremely marginal. The series treated other children even more radically, simply erasing them for narrative clarity. Abdullah, Hürrem's first son, who died in infancy from the plague in 1526, does not exist at all in the series world. He was forgotten so as not to overwhelm the viewer and to focus on the older brothers. There are no intrigues here, only the cruel statistics of child mortality in a world where the plague was a frequent and unwelcome guest. Selim, the future sultan, is portrayed in the series as a charming bungler, constantly getting into trouble because of wine and women. His drunkenness is presented almost as a comic plot, and his infidelities to his wife as fodder for melodrama. The historical Selim II, nicknamed Selim the Drunkard, is by no means a comic figure. His chronic alcoholism was a serious political problem, a symptom of decline and personal weakness that eroded the empire from within. The most epic distortions were bestowed upon Bayezid and Jihangir. On screen, Bayezid is a noble rebel, a romantic hero, perishing in an almost chivalric duel with the system embodied by his father. Reality is far darker and more cynical. After rebelling against Selim, he fled with his family to the Persian Shah Tahmasp. The latter, after lengthy negotiations and upon receiving an enormous sum of gold from Suleiman, handed over the fugitives. This was no heroic duel. It was cold-blooded calculation, eliminating a political risk and the complete eradication of a dynastic branch. No epic battles, just quiet strangulation and trading lives for sacks of coins.
Jihangir, the lame and sickly prince, dies in the series from a broken heart after the execution of his half-brother Mustafa, literally breathing his last in his mother's arms. In reality, Jihangir did indeed witness Mustafa's execution in 1553 and died soon after, but the cause of his death, at age 22, was most likely tuberculosis, or the consequences of congenital illnesses exacerbated by severe psychological trauma. Not an instantaneous heartbreak from grief, but the quiet fading of a sickly man in an atmosphere of collective fear and sorrow. The series amplifies his attachment to Mustafa to the level of a mystical bond to once again press on the viewer's emotions. Even the story of Mihrimah, the only daughter, underwent radical changes. On screen, she's passionate, jealous, entangled in love triangles with fictional characters like Bali Bey. She's portrayed as a manipulator, almost an instigator of Mustafa's execution. The historical Mihrimah was, first and foremost, a distinguished stateswoman. After her mother's death, she became the foremost woman in the dynasty, an influential diplomat and the greatest patroness. The famous mosques by Sinan in Üsküdar and at the Eminönü ferry terminal in Istanbul are her projects, her legacy. Her marriage to Rustem Pasha was a pragmatic union, strengthening Hürrem's clan. No love dramas, only power, architecture, and, by the standards of the time, a fairly long life. The conclusion of this comparison is merciless. Of Hürrem's 6 children who survived past infancy, 4, Abdullah, Mehmed, Mihrimah, Selim, died from natural causes: plague, smallpox, tuberculosis, old age, and only 2, Bayezid and indirectly Jihangir, fell victim to political repression and its consequences. To hold the attention of billions, the series altered this proportion, making violence and poison the main antagonists. It replaced the invisible killer, epidemic disease, with a visible and understandable one: the jealous concubine, the treacherous vizier, the cruel father. This transformed a complex, often random and biologically ruthless history into a neat drama with clear-cut villains and victims. Beautiful, gripping, and very, very far from the dusty pages of Ottoman sources, where the main protagonists were not passions, but microbes and dynastic calculation.